My talk is also primarily inspired by Modern Social Imaginaries, which I think is an important and exciting book. My way of engaging with important and exciting books, it turns out, is rather different from all of these excessively agreeable people I seem to have invited to a conference who think that the way you engage is by extending and praising and agreeing. My way of praising is by criticizing and wrestling, and that's what I'm going to do. In his works about the sweep of history and modernity, especially Sources of the Self, Modern Social Imaginaries, The Malaise of Modernity, and A Secular Age, Charles Taylor has repeatedly returned to the story of the long transition from a society in which the great chain of being was conceived of as an organizing principle, a continuous hierarchical set of relationships from God's governance over and superiority to the angels, to a king's governance over and superiority to his subjects, to a husband and father's governance over and superiority to his wife and children, in which that is understood as so cosmically well-ordered a situation that Shakespeare can meaningfully depict regicide generating unnatural weather and natural disasters because it is such an inversion of the proper natural and cosmic order. And people understand that the regicide is causing the natural disasters. The transition from the great chain of being order to the order that we now inhabit. That order is one that significantly lacks authoritative, hierarchical, natural orderings, and that recenters its attention on us as free and equal persons. It's one with a moral presumption of equality and a demand to justify authority relations of one person over another. Now, Taylor says many times that this process has been a slow and uneven one. One of the final pieces of it, he says, is the understanding that the marital household itself had been a place of unjustified hierarchy and authority, and the replacement of that holdout of the old order with a companionate marriage between equals, a marriage in which a woman would retain her economic, political, moral, and juridical status, would retain the ability to act independently outside the household and not subordinate herself in a way that was analogous to the way subjects subordinated themselves to absolute kings. In Modern Social Imaginaries, that didn't do it. I wish I hadn't noticed that.
Hopefully it will go away.
In Modern Social Imaginaries, after having described this putting into place of the final marital household piece, Taylor says, quote, "Uniformity across niches is far from an obvious common sense requirement. Nevertheless, we have finally come to that uniformity. The long march has finally taken us there." In A Secular Age, using slightly different language about the replacement of a society of orders with a direct access to society, but still expressing a similar idea, he says, "These modes of imagined direct access are linked to, indeed are just different facets of, modern equality and individualism. Directness of access abolishes the heterogeneity of hierarchical belonging. It makes us uniform, and that is one of the ways of becoming equal." And a bit later, we can see right away that in an important sense, modern direct access societies are more homogeneous than pre-modern ones. In my talk, I'm going to prefer the language from A Secular Age and talk about the thesis of the long march to uniformity. While it has taken many centuries, eventually the long march of modernity has taken us to a place in which even the marital household has been reconfigured in a way that is no longer analogous to the absolute monarchy of the era of the great chain of being, but is instead analogous to something like the relationship between free and equal citizens. Now, Taylor's view of processes like these is complicated. His account of modernization stories, of stadial theories of history, on the one hand, includes a history of them emerging. That is to say, he wants to give an account of the way in which the Atlantic West came to give accounts of itself as emerging in a unified, progressive, modernizing way. The stories according to which the turn to science, the turn away from hierarchical religion, the turn eventually away from religious belief at all, the increase in material wealth, the turn to individualism and the individualistic market, the turn to human equality, and the coalescing of the modern state, among other things. The way in which all of those things marched together. That's a particular story that the West came to tell. Modernization stories, stadial theories. And Taylor wishes to show that it doesn't have to be like that. His account of multiple modernities is in part an attempt to say, as we see something like modernization take hold in other parts of the world outside the Atlantic West, it need not be the case that, for example, the embrace of human rights and the embrace of democracy and the realization of the gains to knowledge and to material well-being from the natural sciences will go along with the kinds of secularization that accompanied them in the Atlantic West. So he doesn't endorse modernization stories or stadial stories as it were, utterly true, uniform philosophies of history. They emerged in a particular time and place for particular reasons, and they need not be reproduced in other times and in other places. But it's also the case that, in a strange kind of way, Taylor endorses the modernization thesis as applied to the Atlantic West. He does give an account of the long march of modernity in which those things marched together for us. And they marched together in ways that reinforced one another again and again over time. We can speak of a secular age in the West, succeeding other ages. There's a unity to the ways in which we imagine our social order and lead our moral lives that includes in it each of these things in the bundle that the traditional modernization theorists talked about. Now, the old modernization theorists described their view as the view that all good things go together. Democracy, economic development, education and knowledge, peace and well-being. That as societies progressed along one of these dimensions, they would progress along all of them. And this was a good thing. When Taylor endorses his own thesis of multiple modernities and says the whole bundle doesn't have to hang together like that, he means that as a statement of optimism, not of pessimism, among other reasons, because it means that the collapse in actual religious belief in the West needn't accompany each of the other facets of modernity and modernization. Now, I think that Taylor, for reasons that long predate sources of the self, kind of has to think something like this about human history. The theorist of shared social understandings, the theorist of the ontology of shared and social goods, the theorist of horizons of meaning, is a theorist who tells us we cannot just create our own hyper-local social realities any more than we can create private languages. We inhabit a shared social order that is constituted by our shared interpretations and shared meanings. And so there is pressure over time for our meanings to come to fuse together at the level of something like a society, without providing any particular answer to the question of how big a society is. That is to say, when Taylor says, we now live in an age in which we think religion is a choice, religion is something that could be chosen or not, even though we have our various committed views about what the right choice is to make, and even though many people might experience for themselves religion or irreligion as something other than a choice. That view about what it is to live in this age is, I think, entailed, or at least foreshadowed in an important way, by his philosophy of social science from much earlier in his career. What it is to have religion as a social category is to have a shared social understanding, in part, of what that category is and of how we live it. And our ability to choose it or not to choose it is our social understanding of this age. So the philosophy of history and the philosophy of one imaginary, one system replacing another, I think is not an incidental or only a late developing part of Taylor's theory. This gives me some added trepidation in taking any part of it on, because it means that in taking on some one part, I take on much more of Taylor's thought than I have actual developed arguments against. Nonetheless, I own up to it. I think that the long march toward uniformity stands as a kind of synecdoche for at least the philosophy of history at stake in secular age, and possibly for more of the social theory than that. In this paper, I challenge the march to uniformity thesis as an account of the West, which is all that it's offered as. I argue that there has been no monotonic unfolding of the logic of history, no teleological pull toward some kind of individualistic and egalitarian reconfiguring that gives us uniformity across niches. We don't have uniformity across niches, and the tendencies that push us that way sometimes have, and indeed sometimes generate, counter-tendencies that I think are underappreciated in Taylor's philosophy of history. Now, the account of the Long March of Uniformity, I think, links up with some pieces from elsewhere in Taylor's corpus. And in particular, I have in mind his, I think, still not widely enough read essay on the modes of civil society. In Modes of Civil Society, Taylor describes a Lockean and a Montesquieuian vision of what civil society means, partly drawing on genuine distinctions in how the phrasing was used and partly drawing out philosophically ideal types. Lockean ideal society is individualistic and total. Lockean persons, after all, come together as individuals and then create one unified political society in the manner of social contract theory. And Lockean civil society generated, in a funny kind of way, the civil society of the individualistic economic market, which subtracted the state away from the foreground, but still gave an account of individualistic persons who create a complete order among themselves. Montesquieuian civil society, by contrast, is a civil society of groups and associations. It's the kind of thing that, after Tocqueville's appropriation of ideas like civil society, eventually comes to be what we now think of by default when we use the phrase civil society in social discourse today. Now, Taylor, perhaps unsurprisingly, hopes for a Hegelian synthesis of Lockean and Montesquieuian civil society, hoping for a world in which that which we seek from the political justice of the state will be partly affected, partly constituted by what we do in our group associational lives, rather than just in the kind of individualistic mass politics that arises in democratic contract theory. It's only partly a Hegelian synthesis. He also wishes to maintain the autonomy of group life that is partly outside of politics. But it seems to me that the Long March to Uniformity thesis is a thesis that the synthesis has gone wrong, that Lockean individualism has actually infected the inside of all of the social groups that make up the other kind of civil society, that it becomes harder and harder for us to maintain thick, differentiated group lives over time, because having made the move to thinking about politics in the individualistic egalitarian way, we pick up the social imaginaries of individualism and egalitarianism and start to apply them to one niche after another. And while the tone when Taylor talks about the application of these ideas to marriage is not a mournful tone, I think that the thesis of the March to Uniformity as a whole is not one about which he is especially enthusiastic. There's a loss in the individualizing of too much of our social lives. So perhaps he will take it as good news if I succeed in persuading him that the long march to uniformity is a phantom. There are genuine dynamics toward uniformity. And in what follows, I'm going to partly draw on things that he says in Secular Age, but also spin them and gloss them in different ways and give them an account of my own. One kind of force toward uniformity over time is the kind of thing that Weber talks about in his analysis of the iron cage of modernity, in analyses that Foucault is to reappropriate and transform much later. And two of the most prominent of these are the march to uniformity in state form and the march to uniformity in market relations. When I deny the march to uniformity as a general account, I'm not denying these things. The march to uniformity in market relations is partly a competitive one. Once some subset of humanity starts conceiving of the whole of social relations as consisting of commensurable, tradable, alienable goods that can be counted and bought and sold, a dynamic is created that Marx understood well, whereby more and more of the social world gets competitively caught up in that dynamic. Because that which I once just held and sat on relatively peaceably, I now come to understand as an opportunity cost that I bear every day by not selling it on the open market. Things that I would not have conceived of as economic goods, I'm now more or less forced to at least understand that they could be, and that my refusal to conceive of them as economic goods costs me something. And so market relations have a tendency to spread over more and more aspects of social life and to bring more and more things within their ambit. The competitive force of the state form is even more direct. Once the combination of military and fiscal technology of early modernity that comes together in the Netherlands, England, and France makes possible the quantum leaps forward in military capacity that the early modern state has relative to its rivals, the rivals either catch up and adopt that military and fiscal technology and therefore are incorporated into a gradually spreading state system, or eventually are conquered and therefore incorporated into a spreading state system. And when eventually the European states formally left those parts of the world that they had conquered, they left behind a new normative structure that said what it is to have a political society is to have a thing that looks juridically like a state, making, for the first time in human history, a homogeneous juridical world order. That is uniformity, that is homogeneity in the sense that I think Taylor alludes to. There's an isomorphism that develops over time. Now, I've said nothing about how those two dynamics, the dynamic toward the state and the dynamic toward the market, relate to one another, and I shan't do so other than to say the presence of each both depends on and complicates the presence of the other. So that's one kind of dynamic toward uniformity. I submit that there isn't anything directly like those, that competitive structure that forces outgroups to adopt the new structure lest they be left behind or incorporated. There's nothing like that in the sphere that we now mean when we talk about civil society. There is another dynamic toward uniformity, toward isomorphism of forms, that does directly pressure civil society sometimes. And that's the concern on the part of state actors that when civil society insufficiently resembles the forms of authority represented and valorized by the state, that the state is going to be on an insecure foundation. James I, the great theorist of a divine right monarchy in England, once said that presbytery, that is to say the Presbyterian kind of ecclesiastical government that was being adopted by the Scottish Church at that time, presbytery agreeth as well with monarchy as God doth with the devil. It is utterly incompatible to have Presbyterian ecclesiastical government and monarchical civil government. If we wish to have monarchical civil government, we must have episcopal, that is something like Anglican or Catholic ecclesiastical government. Or people will learn all the wrong lessons. They will think of themselves in the wrong way. They will not see reinforced over and over again in a uniform social imaginary relations of hierarchy and authoritative governance. And so James I embarked on an unsuccessful campaign to undermine and destroy Scottish Presbyterianism. The unsuccess of it matters for how we think about this story in the long term. But James did think it, and his thinking it did put pressure on Presbyterian government in Scotland. My favorite example of this kind of thing is the Freemasons. That's because the Freemasons get it from both sides in early modernity. The Freemasons of the 18th century monarchies and the 18th century aristocratic monarchies looked suspiciously subversive to civil rulers. When you became a Mason to a substantial degree, you checked your external status at the door. Your status as aristocrat did not make you a higher ranking Mason than your bourgeois fellow Mason. Indeed, some Masonic lodges admitted women, and the fact that you were a woman did not mean that you were a less status-worthy Freemason in those lodges than were your male Masonic brethren. And this contributed very openly to the degrees to which the French, Austrian, and other monarchies tried to subvert and destroy Masonry within their borders. They teach a different social ordering from the social ordering that makes the aristocratic monarchy go. Then comes the American Revolution, then comes the generation after the American Revolution, when in the United States, for a period of time, the second most important functioning political party in the country was the Anti-Masonic Party. Why did the United States have an Anti-Masonic Party as a central feature of its political life for a certain stage in the early 19th century? Well, because while you checked your external status at the door, the Masons are internally hierarchical. There are masters and grandmasters. It looks like you are recreating aristocracy within the very bosom of democracy. And we don't know whether the people who are lower in the Masonic order will take orders from those who are higher and will go back out into the world and infect our democratic republic with this relationship of subservience and dependence which violates the presumption of independent republican citizenry. And so the Masons are subject to suspicion and repression for being insufficiently democratic, just a couple generations after having been suspected for the opposite. So those are forces tending toward, and perhaps hastening along, a march toward uniformity. But Taylor says, in giving his account of why there is the long march to uniformity, and this is partly to distance himself from the charge of the bad kind of idealism of which Marxists accuse Hegel, that the march to uniformity that gets us there eventually came not so much because of a natural drive to consistency, it was more the drive to inclusion on the part of certain strata that initially were marginalized in the new order. This is the last phase of the Long March. On the one hand, the extension of the new social imaginary below and beyond the social elites who originally adopted it, and on the other, the extension of the principles of this new imaginary to other levels and niches of social life. We can see right away the first is impossible without the second. Servants and subordinates can't be inducted into imaginary that gives them a place among those equal individuals who make up society unless the social forms of subordination tying them to their betters are transformed. There has to be a break. We get the Long March to Uniformity not because the idea of equality has its own unfolding logic in the world, which I've been using as a shorthand, but I shouldn't be misunderstood, but because those who are excluded from the new equal order struggle against their exclusion. That gives history a direction. When some subset of people adopt a new social imaginary based on equality, it attracts those who are excluded and they struggle for it and they overcome their exclusion. Now, in the first place, I think that there is no such natural tendency in egalitarianism in society, in egalitarianism in politics. The story Taylor offers is derived from the Whiggish account of American history. Here was a people founded on the idea of freedom and equality, and out at the margins there were things that they forgot to notice. There were exclusions from their world of freedom and equality. But over the course of 2 centuries of struggle, the circle of freedom and equality was extended ever outward by something like the dynamic Taylor describes, the interaction of the unfolding force of the idea and the struggle of those who were excluded from it. But egalitarian societies often strengthen their inequalities with respect to outsiders. This is something that Montesquieu and Adam Smith understood when they forecast that democratic and republican societies would be slower to abolish human slavery than would monarchies, as turned out to be true. Why would they be slower to abolish slavery? Well, because the kind of equality that says to, in the American case, the lowest class white person, that you have full human equality and dignity and standing that equals that of the highest member of society, is bought at the direct price of saying, what gives you that greater dignity and status and equality than you thought you had in an order of continuous hierarchy is that you're not black. There's an increase in distance between the lowest members of the newly equal class and all members of what is now an outcast, but was once just the bottom layer of a continuous ladder. The move to Herrenvolk democracy, the move to say, we make ourselves equal by elevating ourselves categorically over some neighboring category, and thereby, I think, meaningfully increasing the inequality in the society. That's something deep and common in the structure of egalitarian politics. It's the Jacksonian Democratic Party, centered in the white South, that does the most to extend suffrage in the United States to all white men. That is, the elitism of the propertied over the propertyless is abolished precisely in the places where the propertyless are going to be elevated over their racial non-kin. Afrikaner Herrenvolk democracy in South Africa was strikingly domestically egalitarian, as it were. Afrikaners led a more egalitarian life among themselves, I think, than one would say the English South Africans had done. That egalitarianism is bought precisely at the price. I think that democratic republicanism in the United States elevating the status of men over the course of the 19th century meant that the place that an aristocratic woman like Madame de Stael could have in Europe becomes progressively unimaginable in the 19th century United States. It would perhaps be easy to say, well, these are the birth pangs of what comes to be a general endorsement, and while maybe things come into existence in complicated ways, eventually we get there. I suspect that that's a little bit too self-congratulatory a vision of where we stand now, and that our future generations will look at our domestically egalitarian states, and see that we have created over the course of the 20th and the early 21st century regimes of barriers to migration that never existed before in human history. The creation of the universal passport and the universal border police and the universal border barriers. These are recent facts, not permanent features of human society. And to some substantial degree, I think that the doctrine that we, citizens of a Western democracy, are all equal to one another is bought at shoving the inequality that much further offstage and offshore, but deepening it still further. That's one reason to doubt the march to uniformity. A second, there are cycles of hierarchy. The American Revolution was born partly out of a fear that the Church of England was planning to plant bishops and archbishops in North America. The rebellion against the threat of episcopacy, which as far as we can tell was an imagined threat, but nonetheless was a fear deeply felt by the Anglo-Americans. This is one of the things that prompted a terror of British rule. The revolution ends, democratic republicanism is something like established in the United States, and one of the very first things that happens in Anglo-American relations is the Americans go to Britain and say, all right, now we need some bishops and archbishops of our own. We need to rebuild the Church of England as a confederal order so that we may have bishops and archbishops in the American Anglican Church who are not themselves servants of the crown. The story of Mormonism, which is, I think, surprisingly little discussed over the course of Taylor's history of religion, is something similar. In a moment of great democratic equality on the American frontier, a new hierarchical Episcopal church comes into being and persists and survives. There's an urge to create something that differs from the spirit of the age. The final reason to doubt the march to uniformity is one about the conflicts generated by pluralism itself. In an increasingly uniform and individualistic age, people will seek out those groups that give them a sense of distinctiveness, meaning, and difference. What we see in the United States is the mainline Protestant churches, Reform Judaism, Unitarianism, all gradually fall by the wayside in terms of their population growth. What are the growing religions? Mormonism, Orthodox Judaism, very religious Catholicism, and especially evangelical Protestantism. Because the view goes, why bother? Why bother to be a Unitarian or Reformed Jew? I get those things in my daily life anyway. That means group life will have a dynamic, not only that doesn't uniformly push us toward democratic, individualistic uniformity, but that might, in the long run, do just the reverse.